All right, we are up to our next topic in the Industrial Revolution. This one we're going to title Industrialization Affects Society as we look at Unit 2, the Industrial Revolution. So far in this unit we've talked about where the Industrial Revolution began. That was, of course, Britain, because of all those factors like natural resources, and entrepreneurs, and stable government, and capital to invest, and so forth. And then we looked at how industrialization began to spread across the globe. It went to Belgium first out of Britain, and then it spread across the continent of Europe, also spread to the United States. And then in our new topic today, what we're going to do is we're going to focus on not big business necessarily, but more the people. Like, how does industrialization actually affect society? So let's jump into the topic. And our first big topic in this is going to be urbanization. Urbanization, guys, simply refers to the growth of cities. In other words, people moving to the cities. That's urbanization. So we have to stop and think, okay, what would have caused this urbanization? What would cause people to move to the cities during the Industrial Revolution? And let's get into our first main idea. So, some causes. Changes in farming, as we talked about in our very first video in this unit, had resulted in increased production of food, which led to a growth in population. It also led to the need for fewer farmers. There just wasn't as much need because we are so much more efficient with our farming techniques. So we have a group of people who are no longer farmers, and then we also have a growing population overall, which means you have, of course, a group of people who need to be employed, and they're going to go to the city to look for those jobs because that's where those industrial jobs were. As factories begin to pop up, there's a huge demand for more and more workers. So we can see this trend as we look at these graphs. Manchester, Glasgow, London, Birmingham, these are all British cities, and you can see the population growth is tremendous between those 2 years of 1800 and 1870. So here we are looking at kind of a part of an industrial city, British city, and we can see some things in this picture, like the smokestacks, the fact that the river is right there, so the factory, of course, was built along the river. We've got, small grouping of buildings are all tightly packed together to maximize the use of land. And what you would see is, if you looked at this kind of as a pattern, factories tended to clump together, and they would clump together near resources and transportation routes. So rivers initially, but then later, of course, railroads. And this, again, maximizes the efficiency of those factories. So one city in particular that really symbolizes this industrial revolution is the city of Manchester. And if you're not familiar with British geography, Manchester is right there. There's London, the capital of the United Kingdom. And Manchester became kind of like the focus city for Britain's textile industry. Remember, textiles are all about cloth products, clothing, anything cloth related. And in fact, they dominated the textile industry to an extent that Manchester was nicknamed Cottonopolis. Polis is just a suffix that means like basically city. Think of Indianapolis, Minneapolis, all these cities that end with that. Annapolis is another good one. So this city has some positives and negatives. On the positive side, of course, with all these factories, lots and lots of jobs are going to spring up, and it's going to generate a lot of wealth for some individuals. Here we are looking at Manchester, and yeah, you get the impression that the Industrial Revolution was not great for the environment. So on the downside for Manchester, what are some negatives of being Cottonopolis? Well, one is that the population growth was so quick and so uncontrolled that it led to overcrowding. It led to pollution. And so the city itself is kind of nothing positive to look at. It would have looked kind of gray, and the water would have been filthy. And the French traveler and writer Alexis de Tocqueville visited Manchester and referred to the city by saying this. He said, "From this filthy sewer, pure gold flows." And what he means by that, of course, is the filthy sewer is Manchester and its industrialization. The gold is the wealth that it produces. So yes, lots of wealth being produced, but on the downside, the city itself is not a very pleasant place to live in. couple more images here of Manchester. Again, you can see the effects of industrialization, just heavy, thick clouds of coal smoke, and there's a train going over. And in fact, you may not remember this, but from our first video, we talked about how Manchester and Liverpool were those first two cities connected by a passenger railroad. All right, let's talk a little bit about working conditions now in the Industrial Revolution. And we're going to find out that workers in factories and mines faced a lot of dangers and long hours. So let's think modern day America for a second. So the average work day in America today for most people is about 8 hours. Certainly some people work more, some people work less, but 8 hours is a good general round number we can use. For comparison, during the Industrial Revolution, a lot of industrial workers were working 12 hours or more during the day. And the conditions were not ideal. Okay, the factories were often dimly lit. They tended to be a little filthy. There were lots and lots of dangers, as we're going to look at in just a second, in these factories. And the pay was not great. And one of the reasons the pay is not great is the population is growing so rapidly. There's this huge demand for workers. So if everyone wants a job, some people are going to be willing to work for less than others to get that job. So prices tend to be kind of pushed down because of those factors. So here we are looking at a picture of a textile mill, and clearly dangers abound in this picture. The most obvious is this spinning wheel here, and the fact that she's wearing a long dress. That's not a good combination, right? You also have all kinds of stuff laying around the ground that someone could slip on. In a textile mill also, you can't really see it from this picture, but there's going to be kind of this like almost like a cloth dust in the air constantly that you're breathing in. And again, if you're working long hours, you might get a little tired, and maybe your attention wanes just a little bit, and maybe you accidentally put your hand down in the wrong place, and then you're seriously injured. And this is a time period when there was no real protection for workers. There was no government agency forcing factories to have safe conditions. There was no like some sort of workman's compensation like we have today. Basically, if you were injured or if you were ill, you would often just lose your job. Then your family faced ruin. And that's the point this cartoon is trying to make. You have these women climbing up here, and they're employees in the mills, right, in the textile mills, and they're being ground up by the factory owner, and what's coming out are the profits. So this cartoon is trying to imply that the factory owners just saw their workers as basically a commodity to be used up to make money. And then over here we have people in the shop looking at all these products made by the workers, and they say things like, I cannot imagine how they can positively make it can be made for the price. In other words, I can't believe how low these prices are. And that's what they're thinking about. They're thinking about the low prices. They're not thinking about the effects on the workers. Speaking of workers, here we are looking at a couple of workers. Now this is obviously from the 20th century, not the 18th or 19th century, but nonetheless, it kind of gives you an idea of what their occupation is, and clearly they are coal miners, right? So let's think about coal miners for a second. You have all kinds of dangerous conditions to work in. Mines tended to flood. There were explosive gases that were unearthed as mines were dug, and so this would lead sometimes to accidental explosions. Mines, of course, could cave in, and even if you survived the water, the explosions, the cave-ins, what you're really facing is the danger of all that dust that you're breathing in. They didn't have the kind of respirators and things coal miners have today. And so they would develop oftentimes something called black lung, which basically your lungs just get ruined from breathing in all that coal dust. Some images here of our coal miners. Again, these are pretty young workers. You can definitely tell that this is not a safe working environment from the modern perspective anyways. So in the condition of women and children, they would work long hours just like men, but they would be paid less. And this reflects the fact that women and children could legally be paid less than men back then. Also, there were certain jobs that kids were seen seen as more suitable for, often because of their small size. Perhaps they could fit under machinery or reach into a piece of machinery that maybe an adult could not. And so they were seen as a valuable workforce. But again, these are children, and kids in the modern day, they're out playing, they're going to school, they're having fun, and these kids are clearly not doing any of those things. Notice also we have a supervisor here, and he's holding a whip. Sometimes these kids would get a little drowsy after working all day, and there was always the threat of the whip to keep them going. Here's a great picture of a textile worker. This is taken, I believe, sometime in the early 20th century, but it's pretty indicative of what you would have seen also even in the 18th and 19th century. And, she's very, very young, right? In modern day, she would be in school, not working in a mill. So you might ask yourself why parents would accept this life for their kids when it's, obviously not ideal for kids. And there's a lot of reasons. The most pressing one, of course, is the need for money. These families needed kind of all hands on deck working to earn money for the family to support their rent and their food and everything else. But then there's also this tradition. If you think back to the days where most people were farmers, kids worked on the farm. It was not seen as unusual to have kids working long hours on the farm. So some people just took that idea and applied it to the industrial sphere, that why not have kids work long hours in a factory? How is it any different than them working on the family farm? So a couple images here of children working in the mines. Just dangers abound, right? This is just, this would be child abuse in the modern sense, but that was just kind of life for these kids. One job in particular that was just of note for being pretty bad would be the chimney sweep. And a chimney sweep is basically a little kid who would be sent down into the chimney. You can see the harness here he's wearing. Be sent down into the chimney, and he would scrape it clean from all the soot and stuff that builds up on the inside of chimneys. I can't even imagine sending a little kid down into a dark space like this, how claustrophobic and scary that would be for that kid. All right, let's take a look at living conditions now. And we're going to find out that they were not ideal in these industrial cities. So you would often have near the factories very crowded, frankly pretty dirty, unsafe neighborhoods. People, they're walking to work, and so they have to live close to the factory, and so they're living among the pollution. They're not being paid very well, so the neighborhood is kind of dingy. There's no real garbage collection like we have today, and so things just, waste just kind of gathers. There was also no modern sewage system in these early days. It's just very dirty, very smelly, very bleak, honestly. Not at all safe conditions. So here we're looking at, I believe this is Manchester again. If not, it's some British industrial city. And you look at the living conditions, everything's very tightly packed. It's all very standardized. Everyone's apartment building looks about the same. And also we see the train going by, again, evidence of industrialization. But one thing I always challenge my students when they look at this picture in class is what's missing. And they often think about it, and some people eventually come up with the answers, and that's, well, where are the trees? Where's the vegetation? Where's the life? It looks just so lifeless in this image. All right, so all that overcrowding, all that overwork, a lack of modern medicine like we have today led to widespread sicknesses. And these sicknesses would take people's lives. So life expectancy was much, much lower back then. One killer in particular was cholera. And cholera is basically it's like an infection of your intestines, and it leads to diarrhea and vomiting and severe dehydration to the point where eventually you can perish from this. And it's the condition, it's a result rather of the contaminated water that many people were drinking, because this is something that is waste, human waste would get into the water, and people would drink that, the cholera would then be spread. And so you'd have these mass outbreaks of cholera in the cities where lots of people would die just in droves. All right, let's shift our gears a little bit and look at the middle class, the industrial middle class, who are benefiting from the Industrial Revolution. So it's during the Revolution that the middle class that we kind of know as today was basically invented. And we all know what middle class means. You're not poor, you're not rich, you're somewhere in the middle. And the Industrial Revolution really opened a lot of doors to this new class. So a middle class person lives a pretty comfortable life. They tend to have access to education. They tend to be paid fairly well for their skills because they bring with them skills and education that the working class doesn't. So instead of being a factory worker, perhaps they might be like a manager in the factory, or maybe they're an accountant for the factory owner, or maybe they're a lawyer that represents the factory owner in court. And so these people, again, lived a very, very different life. Their neighborhoods tended to be tree-lined and quieter, it's safer, cleaner, healthier, just a very, very different environment from the working class. All right, our last big topic, guys, we're going to look at so-called labor unions. If you're not aware of what a labor union is, it is basically just a group of workers who come together for the purpose of trying to improve their living and working conditions. And so they would collectively go to their employer and ask for things like higher wages or shorter working hours or safer working conditions. And labor unions were something that were illegal for much of the Industrial Revolution on both sides of the Atlantic. And labor unions also tended to accompany things like strikes, and strikes tended to bring about violence. So this is a very tumultuous time, and you can see evidence of potential violence in this picture, right? You have these workers confronting the entrepreneur, the businessman, maybe the factory owner or something, and you see this guy picking up a rock, and that could lead to conflict. So as I said a moment ago, what labor unions want is they want better working conditions, shorter hours, and better pay for their workers. And that's something labor unions continue to push, although labor unions tend to not be as prominent today as they used to be. All right, so actually, I take that back. This is going to be our last topic, guys. Not labor unions. This one's going to be our last one. And let's look at some positives and negatives of industrialization. So I've made industrialization sound pretty bad today, right? A lot of disease and pollution and all this stuff. But in fact, there are a lot of positives. And ironically enough, despite all the dangers and the lack of modern medicine and such, what you're going to notice is life expectancy actually increased during the Industrial Revolution, right? It's going up, up, up. So let's get into some positive effects. With industrialization comes mass production, and with mass production, the price of goods go down, and also the quality will increase as companies compete to get more customers. So yes, was it bad making the products in the factories? Absolutely, but for the consumers, they benefit from being able to afford more stuff. As I said a moment ago, people are living longer than ever, and the standard of living does slowly increase. And the standard of living simply means how you're living, like your housing, your health, your working conditions, all those things. That all is kind of wrapped into this term, standard of living, and it's getting better as the Industrial Revolution begins. All right, guys, that is it for our look at industrialization affects society. And in our next video, we're going to talk a little bit about some new industrial ideas about how the economy and how politics should function. Thank you.